We speak now to Adam Igdal from Boston Consulting Group. Thank you very much, Adam, for your time. So essentially, when we talk about good governance, first of all, what are we talking about?
Well, we see that there are three things that governments need to do in order to handle crises like that. First of all, you need clear management, clear leadership from the top. Secondly, you need good cross-government agency cooperation. And thirdly, you need to communicate frequently and very transparently. So those are the three things that we see that governments need to do in times of crisis.
So let's talk about clear management and leadership, and particularly maybe focus on the African continent in terms of management and leadership on the continent. There is a widely held view that the coronavirus has perhaps brought to the fore, even more so, the lack of good governance on the continent. Is that a fair statement?
I think in the beginning, this is something new that we haven't experienced for more than 100 years. So I think it's natural to see that there's a little bit of lack of coordination at the start of this crisis. Having said that, I think our President, Cyril Ramaphosa, also as the leader of the African Union, are doing all he can to kind of combine the forces. And I think we see green shoots in Africa for a more coordinated effort against COVID-19.
And we talk about frequent communication. You mentioned that as being one of the pillars of good governance. We see almost every other day we have press conferences, and our leadership is doing their best to address the issue. But when we talk about frequent communication, and then we look at some of the concessions that have been made in terms of regulations, two schools of thoughts on this. Some people saying that if you're going to implement a lockdown and stick to it. And other people saying, well, I mean, in a country like South Africa, an unequal society, you're going to have people whom we're going to need to make concessions for.
No, definitely. I think what's important and what we've seen from other countries, it is important to be very clear on the practical guidelines for people. And I think in a country like South Africa, I think it is what the president has done is exactly the right thing. If you start to ease up on regulation and people try to interpret the rules themselves, you're going to get into a situation that's not good. So I think the way the government went into this lockdown and being very clear that you have to shelter at home and you should not move around is exactly the right thing. Having said that, given what you see, for example, in the townships where it's incredibly difficult to do social distancing and also heavily reliant on taxis to get around, of course, you need to have a pragmatic approach to that. And I think the way the government has done it has been exactly right.
Adam, can we talk about good governance without mentioning bad governance? What is it?
I think the most important thing is around transparency and not being overly optimistic when communicating to your people. I think, for example, what we see in the US, I think is a good example of someone where you can have much more positive kind of rhetoric towards the people. The problem with that is that when the reality hits and people see that what you've communicated isn't necessarily true, you lose credibility in your ongoing communication with the public. So what a very important factor is actually being very honest, very transparent, and being guided by science rather than political partisanship.
A lot of people, you hear it very often that things will never be the same again after this. What do you think perhaps the future of governance is?
I think what this has shown us, particularly in South Africa, is a huge opportunity. It could actually be the catalyst for much more cooperation between government, labor, private sector, and social citizenship. I think having a focal point like that, rallying around it, and showing ourselves and the world that we can do this and be best practice, I think maybe it can unlock cooperation and a social compact that we haven't seen before in South Africa.
Adam Igdal from Boston Consulting Group, a pleasure chatting to you this afternoon.